JD Vance tries to lecture Ibrahim Traoré, but he rejects the USAID, ends the conversation. The whispers died as Ibrahim Traoré entered the conference room, his military posture unwavering despite the weight of a nation on his shoulders. At 34, the youngest president in the world commanded an unspoken respect that contradicted the dismissive glances exchanged between the Western officials. Their tailored suits and practiced smiles couldn't mask the condescension in their eyes that saw Africa as a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. Traoré adjusted his collar, the simple gesture deliberate and unhurried. Maps of Burkina Faso lay spread across the polished table, each marking another village lost to terrorism, another community desperate for protection. He ran his finger along the northern border, remembering the faces of families who'd placed their trust in him after years of broken promises from foreign powers. The American delegation arrived with the confidence of those who believed their checkbooks gave them authority. JD Vance entered last, his stride purposeful, his handshake firm but fleeting as he met Traoré's steady gaze. Behind Vance's diplomatic smile lurked the absolute certainty that he understood Africa's problems better than those who lived them. "Mr. President," Vance said, the formality unable to mask his underlying tone, "we're eager to discuss how America can guide Burkina Faso toward a more productive future." Traoré nodded once, revealing nothing. What happens next would reshape diplomatic relations between Burkina Faso and the Western world forever. Before we continue, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this ends. The memory of dust and gunfire lingered with Ibrahim Traoré. Just 14 months ago he had been Captain Traoré, leading his men through Ouagadougou's streets, while the fate of Burkina Faso hung in the balance. The corrupt government had fallen, not from his ambition, but from necessity. From the cries of villagers raised by terrorists, while Western allies watched from a distance, offering sympathy without substance. "Our citizens were dying," Traoré said quietly to his aide, as they prepared for the larger meeting. "France had troops here for years, yet somehow the violence only grew worse. When they withdrew, they left nothing but empty barracks and unfulfilled promises." Now, as President Traoré, he examined the USAID proposal, before him with the methodical care of a man who understood that gifts often carried hidden costs. The leather portfolio Vance had presented contained promises of agricultural support, military training, infrastructure, all desperately needed, all contingent on conditions written in diplomatic language that couldn't disguise their true intent. Across the table, Vance leaned forward, his confidence unwavering. "Russia cannot offer what we can, Mr. President. Their equipment is outdated, their promises empty. Look at Mali, at the Central African Republic. What have their Russian alliances truly brought them?" Traoré's expression remained impassive, but his mind calculated the implications behind each word. The Americans hadn't come help Burkina Faso. They had come to push Russia out of Africa. "Your concern for our welfare is noted," Traoré replied, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a chess player. "Though I wonder where this concern was when we requested emergency assistance last year." Vance's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Administrative transitions. I assure you, America stands ready now." The young diplomat beside Traoré, Adama Ouedraogo, American educated but Burkinabe in his soul, shifted subtly in his seat. His eyes met Traoré's for a fraction of a second. A silent communication between countrymen amid foreign interests. "Perhaps," Vance continued, sliding glossy photographs across the table, showing Russian PMCs in neighboring Mali, "you're unaware of the danger these mercenaries pose to democratic institutions. Their presence in the region has coincided with significant human rights concerns." The unspoken accusation hung in the air. Traoré had allowed similar Russian military trainers into Burkina Faso after Western nations withdrew support. Traoré folded his hands, his military training evident in his composed demeanor. The son of farmers who had worked himself through university before joining the armed forces, he recognized patronizing tones, whether they came from colonial administrators of the past or aid directors of the present. "Mr. Vance," Traoré said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room without rising. "When terrorists massacred 86 of my people in Solhan, we received condolences. When we requested advanced weaponry to protect our borders, we received lectures on human rights. When Russian trainers offered immediate assistance without political conditions, we accepted." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Vance's expression hardened as he realized this would not be the easy diplomatic victory his superiors had anticipated. "Perhaps," Traoré added, meeting Vance's gaze directly, "you'd like to hear about our country's needs from our perspective, Mr. Vance." Behind Vance, an aide whispered something urgent in his ear. Vance nodded almost imperceptibly, then gestured toward the door. "By all means, Mr. President. But this conversation might be better suited for the main conference. Your regional partners are waiting, and I believe this discussion could benefit from additional perspectives." Traoré recognized the tactic surrounding him with other African leaders dependent on American aid, creating peer pressure to accept the conditions. He nodded once, gathering his papers. "Lead the way, Mr. Vance. I'm certain my perspective will remain the same, regardless of the audience." The main conference room hummed with diplomatic tension. Representatives from Mali, Niger, Chad, and other African nations sat alongside European and American officials, the divide between them more than geographical. Ibrahim Traoré took his place at the circular table, noting how the seating arrangement subtly positioned the Western representatives at what would traditionally be considered the head. JD Vance stood before a large screen, displaying USAID's new initiative for the Sahel region, Partnership for Security and Prosperity. The name itself carried the American tendency to package political requirements as benevolent assistance. "Our comprehensive support package includes $2 billion in development aid, military training programs, and preferential trade agreements," Vance announced, his confidence filling the room. "The United States stands ready to help our African partners address the root causes of extremism and economic stagnation." A graph appeared showing projected economic growth. The numbers looked impressive, until one examined the footnotes detailing the conditions attached to each dollar. "Of course," Vance continued, his tone shifting slightly. "Effective partnership requires alignment of priorities and values. Recent security arrangements with non-traditional actors in the region undermine collective security efforts and democratic principles." The diplomatic language couldn't mask his meaning. "Cut ties with Russia or lose American support." Traoré studied the faces around him. The finance minister from Niger looked down at his papers. The representative from Chad glanced nervously at the American delegation. They all understood the language of conditional aid, the modern collar replacing colonial chains. "If I may," Traoré spoke, his voice measured yet carrying an authority that drew all eyes to him. "We appreciate the United States' interest in our regional challenges. However, I'm curious about this requirement for security alignment. When terrorists overran our northern provinces last year, we requested urgent military assistance from our traditional partners." He turned a page in his folder, withdrawing a letter. This was the response we received. "Allow me to quote, current budgetary constraints and legislative requirements regarding certification of democratic institutions preclude immediate security assistance. 43 civilians died in Djibo while this letter was en route to my office." Murmurs spread around the table. Adama Ouedraogo, the young diplomat, slid a file toward Traoré containing additional correspondence he had compiled. Documentation of unanswered requests for assistance. Vance's expression tightened. "The situation was complex, Mr. President. Congressional approval processes were remarkably accelerated for Ukraine," Traoré finished. "I don't blame the Ukrainian people for receiving the help they desperately needed. I simply note the inconsistency and urgency when African lives hang in the balance." A French representative leaned forward. "These comparisons are unhelpful, Mr. President. The situations are entirely different geopolitical contexts." "Different contexts, same human lives," Traoré replied. "When Russian trainers arrived within 2 weeks of our request, They didn't bring ideology. They brought anti-aircraft systems that prevented massacres in 3 villages. Vance paced slightly, recalibrating his approach. President Traoré, no one questions your commitment to your people's security, but these Russian mercenaries come with hidden costs. Their presence has consistently corresponded with increased civilian casualties, resource exploitation, and declining press freedoms across Africa. Traoré allowed himself the slightest smile. An interesting correlation analysis, Mr. Vance. I've recently reviewed a similar study correlating American military presence with increased regional instability. Perhaps causation is more complex than either analysis suggests. An uncomfortable silence fell across the room. Several African representatives exchanged glances, some concerned, others quietly impressed. Vance's aide whispered something in his ear, and he nodded before adopting a more conciliatory tone. Our goal is constructive partnership, Mr. President. Perhaps we can discuss a transitional framework that addresses your security concerns while gradually realigning with traditional partners. Traditional partners, Traoré repeated thoughtfully. Colonial powers became development partners, security allies, and traditional partners. The terminology evolves while the relationship remains fundamentally unequal. He opened another file, revealing World Bank data. Let me illustrate. After following IMF structural adjustment programs for 20 years, our country has seen external debt increase by 200%. Public services collapse, and resource extraction accelerate, predominantly benefiting Western corporations. The representative from Chad spoke up, his voice hesitant. President Traoré raises valid concerns, but we must be pragmatic. American support comes with significant technological advantages. Indeed, Traoré acknowledged. Yet pragmatism must include historical awareness. When President Sankara attempted to develop self-sufficient economic policies for our nation, his government was overthrown with well-documented Western support. When Patrice Lumumba sought true independence for Congo, he was assassinated with Belgian and American involvement. Pragmatism without sovereignty is simply surrender. Vance's professional demeanor showed the first cracks of genuine frustration. We can't productively address the challenges of today by relitigating history, Mr. President. The United States is offering concrete assistance now, for your people's benefit. Adama Ouedraogo raised his hand slightly, receiving a nod from Traoré. Despite his American education, his loyalty to Burkina Faso had never wavered. If I may, Adama said, I've analyzed the proposed assistance package in detail. While the headline figures are impressive, implementation timelines show only 12% of funds disbursed in the first year, with the majority contingent on certification requirements that would effectively grant veto power over domestic policy to external evaluators. Vance's eyes narrowed at the young diplomat, recognizing a formidable mind behind the respectful exterior. That's a miscategorization of standard accountability practices. Is it? Adama slid copies of his analysis to other African representatives. Page 17 shows that education funding is contingent on curriculum review by external consultants. Page 23 indicates agricultural assistance requires accepting specific GMO licensing agreements with American corporations. The Nigerian representative studied the document with growing concern. These conditions weren't highlighted in the executive summary. Appendices often contain the most revealing details, Traoré said quietly. Vance's patience visibly thinned. Every partnership includes mutual obligations. You can't expect billions in assistance without alignment on basic principles and methodologies. Principles like sovereignty? Traoré asked. Like the right to choose our own partners based on our national interest, rather than great power competition. The temperature in the room seemed to rise with the tension. Vance conferred briefly with his team before turning back to address the gathering. Let me be direct, President Traoré. Since you prefer plain speaking, the United States cannot provide security assistance to governments actively cooperating with Russian military entities. It's not personal, it's policy. Congress won't approve funds for countries hosting Wagner Group or similar Russian proxies. And thus we arrive at the truth. Traoré said, his voice calm. Despite the ultimatum, this isn't about Burkina Faso's development or security. It's about containing Russian influence, with African welfare as a secondary consideration. Vance straightened his tie, abandoning pretense. American taxpayers expect their foreign assistance to advance American interests and values. That's reality in any nation, including yours. Then we have clarity, Traoré nodded. You've presented your conditions. Now I will explain ours. The shift in language from supplicant to equal caused several Western representatives to exchange uneasy glances. Burkina Faso will partner with any nation that respects our sovereignty, responds to our urgent needs, and deals with us as equals, Traoré continued. We will not accept assistance that requires us to compromise our independence or abandon partners who stood with us when others would not. Vance's expression hardened. That position leaves us little room for cooperation, Mr. President. On the contrary, Traoré replied, it creates the only foundation for genuine cooperation. We welcome American partnership, but not American control, the French representative interjected, his tone condescending. This ideological stance may satisfy national pride, President Traoré, but it won't feed your people or secure your borders. Be reasonable. Reasonableness, Traoré observed, seems defined as accepting whatever terms are dictated to us, regardless of their impact on our sovereignty. As tension mounted, Vance delivered his ultimatum. No longer bothering with diplomatic niceties, let me be absolutely clear. Accept our conditions or lose American support entirely. There is no third option. Traoré met his gaze unflinchingly, the room falling silent in anticipation of his response. Ibrahim Traoré rose from his seat with the deliberate calm of a man who had faced death on the battlefield. The room fell silent, diplomats and officials leaning forward imperceptibly. Even the interpreters paused, sensing the gravity of the moment. Mr. Vance, Traoré began, his voice carrying clearly without raising it. Before I respond to your ultimatum, I'd like to share something with everyone present. He nodded to Adama Ouedraogo, who distributed slim folders to each representative. The young diplomat moved with quiet purpose, his eyes briefly meeting Traoré's with unspoken solidarity. These documents detail the outcomes of the last 3 major USAID initiatives in Burkina Faso. Traoré continued, waiting as the folders were opened. You'll note that for every $1 of aid received, approximately $4 exited our country in the form of profit repatriation, consultant fees to Western firms, and debt servicing. A murmur rippled through the African delegates as they reviewed figures. The Malian representative's eyebrows raised as he studied a particular page. Page 3 shows that 68% of funds allocated for rural development were actually spent on American consultants who stayed in Ouagadougou's luxury hotels and produced reports recommending privatization of our water utilities. Traoré's voice remained measured, but carried an undercurrent of controlled indignation. Meanwhile, the villages those consultants never visited continued to walk miles for clean water. Vance shifted uncomfortably, but maintained his composure. Administrative overhead is a necessary component of ensuring effective. The second document, Traoré continued, uninterrupted, contains intelligence briefings regarding democracy promotion initiatives funded through USAID's subsidiaries in neighboring countries. Note the correlation between these programs and subsequent political instability in governments that resisted specific economic policies. The Chad representative flipped pages with increasing alarm, exchanging glances with his counterpart from Niger. This is highly selective and misleading information, Vance interjected, his frustration breaking through. These documents lack context and present conspiracy theories as fact. Perhaps, Traoré acknowledged, with a slight tilt of his head. But they align perfectly with our lived experience. When President Sankara sought to make Burkina Faso self-sufficient, refusing IMF loans in favor of local development, foreign interests ensured his government fell. When we discovered new mineral deposits and sought more favorable terms with extractive corporations, suddenly our security assistance was delayed pending human rights assessments. The French representative closed his folder sharply. This historical revisionism serves no constructive purpose, Mr. President. History is only revisionism to those who wrote the original narrative, Traoré replied, his gaze steady. To us, it is simply truth finally spoken aloud. He walked slowly around the table, every eye following him. The military discipline in his posture had transformed into the quiet authority of a leader who had found his purpose. China has offered infrastructure development with longer grace periods and lower interest rates than the World Bank, Traoré stated, stopping behind his chair. Russia has provided immediate military assistance when our people were being massacred, asking only for normal diplomatic relations in return. Turkey has proposed agricultural partnerships that would build our capacity rather than create dependency. He paused, letting the implications settle. Yet we're told these partnerships threatened our sovereignty, while accepting conditions that dictate our economic policies, educational curricula, and security relationships somehow preserves it. Vance stood abruptly, matching Traoré's stance. Those countries aren't offering partnership. They're pursuing extraction with fewer safeguards and transparency requirements. They don't share democratic values. Values, Traoré repeated thoughtfully. In 1997, Burkina Faso had the democratic election you now insist upon. We elected a government that sought to nationalize our mineral resources to fund public services. Within months, that government faced civil society protests, funded by organizations that coincidentally received USAID grants. A tense silence filled the room. We are not rejecting friendship with America, Traoré continued, his voice softening without losing its resolve. We are rejecting paternalism. We are rejecting the notion that our sovereignty is conditional upon making choices that prioritize your geopolitical interests over our citizens' immediate needs. Vance's expression hardened. Fine words, Mr. President, but reality is more complicated. Without our security assistance, the terrorist threats you face will only grow. Without development aid, your economy will stagnate. These aren't threats, they're facts. Perhaps, Traoré conceded. Or perhaps they reflect assumptions based on a paradigm that no longer exists. The world is changing, Mr. Vance. Africa is changing. He turned to address the entire gathering, his presence commanding despite his youth. For centuries, Africa has been told that our salvation lies in following paths laid out by others, paths that somehow always lead to our resources flowing outward, while debt and dependency flow inward. We've been told development requires accepting inequality as a natural condition of the global order. The Niger representative nodded slowly, his earlier hesitation transforming into contemplation. Today we have choices we didn't have before, Traoré continued. We can build infrastructure with Chinese investment, develop agriculture with Turkish partnership, secure our borders with Russian assistance, and still trade with Europe and America, if they're willing to engage as equal partners rather than patrons. Equal partners, Vance repeated, with barely concealed condescension. Your entire budget wouldn't fund a mid-sized American city for a year. That's not inequality. It's economic reality. A flash of genuine anger crossed Traoré's face before his military discipline reasserted control. Our poverty wasn't inevitable, Mr. Vance. It was engineered. When we had gold, it was extracted through concessions that left us with 9% of the value. When we had cotton, trade rules ensured we couldn't develop textile industries. When we sought loans for development, structural adjustment programs forced us to cut education and healthcare. He placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. So yes, we are poor by your metrics, but we are immeasurably rich in resources, determination, and increasingly in options. Adamo Ouedraogo cleared his throat softly, drawing attention. Despite his youth, his voice carried the weight of someone who understood both worlds. If I may translate President Traoré's position into policy terms, he offered, his American education evident in his diplomatic phrasing. Burkina Faso isn't rejecting cooperation with the United States. We're proposing a restructured relationship based on mutual respect, non-interference in sovereign decisions, and equitable terms of exchange. Vance's frustration was palpable as he sensed the mood in the room shifting. The ultimatum that should have brought this young, inexperienced president to heel was instead unraveling decades of carefully cultivated influence. Let me be frank, Vance said. abandoning pretense entirely. The international system operates on power realities, not wishful thinking. Your Russian friends can't match our development assistance. Your Chinese partners will own your infrastructure when you default on their loans. You need us more than we need you. Traoré's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. When he spoke again, his voice was forced, yet reached every corner of the silent room. We have endured far worse than the loss of conditional charity, Mr. Vance. The statement hung in the air, simple yet devastating in its truth. Several African representatives straightened imperceptibly in their seats, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the power dynamic. My government will not accept assistance that requires us to surrender our right to determine our own partnerships, Traoré continued, his resolution absolute. If that means American aid stops, then it stops. We will look to our African brothers and sisters, to South-South cooperation, and to partners who respect our sovereignty. Vance's hand clenched involuntarily. His voice, when it came, carried the first notes of genuine uncertainty. This is reckless idealism that your people will pay for. Not you personally. We consider your position. My position, Traoré replied with quiet dignity, is standing with my people rather than standing over them. If that's idealism, then perhaps the world needs more of it. He turned to address the African representatives directly, no longer performing for Western approval. For too long, we've accepted that our choices were limited to which external power would control our destiny. Today, I'm choosing a different path, one where African solutions address African challenges, where cooperation doesn't require submission, and where our people's needs outweigh geopolitical games. The Malian representative nodded openly now, abandoning diplomatic neutrality. The Nigerian delegate leaned forward with new interest. Even the representative from Chad, heavily dependent on French military support, seemed to be reconsidering long-held assumptions. Vance conferred urgently with his team, their whispered conversation growing increasingly tense. The French and British representatives exchanged alarmed glances as the careful choreography of the meeting dissolved into something unpredictable and potentially revolutionary. When Vance turned back to the table, his expression had transformed into cold calculation. President Traoré, your position has been noted. The United States will need to re-evaluate our relationship with Burkina Faso in light of your priorities. There will be consequences for this choice. Traoré met his gaze without flinching. There have always been consequences for African dignity, Mr. Vance. The difference is that now, we choose which consequences we will accept. The conference room erupted into a flurry of activity as the formal meeting dissolved. African delegates clustered in urgent conversation, their whispered exchanges charged with a new energy. Western representatives huddled with their teams, phones pressed to ears as they reported this unexpected development to their capitals. Vance retreated to a corner with his delegation, his expression thunderous as he gestured emphatically to his staff. Occasionally his eyes darted toward Traoré, the calculation in them shifting between disbelief and recalibration. Ibrahim Traoré stood quietly with Adama Ouedraogo, their conversation private amid the chaos they had unleashed. You understand what follows, Traoré said softly, watching the reactions around the room. They will make an example of us. Adama nodded, his expression solemn yet resolute. The currency markets by tomorrow, media narratives by the weekend, security intelligence discovering concerns within the month. Are you prepared for what this means for your career? Traoré asked, studying the young diplomat who had become one of his most trusted advisors. Your American education, your connections, they'll expect you to moderate my position, not reinforce it. My education taught me to analyze systems objectively. Adama replied with a slight smile. The analysis led me here, to this position, to this moment. Beyond the glass walls of the conference room, journalists had gathered, alerted by whispered calls from those inside. Cameras captured the unusual spectacle of Western diplomats in disarray, while African representatives displayed a rare unity of purpose. The Malian delegate approached Traoré, extending his hand. A bold stand, Mr. President. Mali stands with Burkina Faso, as does Niger, added another representative, joining them. Though we will all feel the backlash from this. Traoré clasped their hands in turn. Perhaps. But for once, we'll feel it together, standing rather than kneeling. Across the room, a junior USAID official separated from Vance's group and approached Adama hesitantly. "We've worked together on the agricultural initiatives," she said quietly. "This doesn't have to be the end of everything. There are those of us who understand the legitimate concerns you've raised." Adama studied her, measuring sincerity against institutional loyalty. "Then perhaps you'll be part of building something better from these ashes." Meanwhile, Vance had composed himself enough to approach Traoré directly, his smile diplomatic once more but unable to reach his eyes. "President Traoré," he began, his voice lowered to avoid being overheard. "Perhaps we've started on the wrong foot. I'm authorized to discuss certain exemptions, flexibility in the implementation timeline. We can find middle ground here." Traoré regarded him thoughtfully. "The middle ground between sovereignty and submission still involves yielding what should never be negotiable, Mr. Vance. This ideological purity will hurt your people," Vance insisted, the veneer of diplomacy slipping. "The world operates on practical realities, not philosophical principles." "My people have already been hurting," Traoré replied simply. "The difference now is that their suffering might finally have purpose, building something that belongs to them rather than enriching others." A commotion at the door drew their attention as journalists pressed closer, sensing the historic nature of what was unfolding. A camera flash illuminated Traoré's face, capturing the moment for front pages across Africa. "You think Russia and China will treat you better?" Vance asked, making one final attempt. "They're not known for their generosity or respect for sovereignty." "Perhaps not," Traoré acknowledged, "but their self-interest currently aligns with our need for non-conditional partnerships. And unlike our experience with the West, we enter these relationships with eyes open, without illusions of benevolence." The Nigerian representative joined them, adding his perspective. "What President Traoré has articulated reflects growing sentiment across the continent. Mr. Vance, the rules-based order you champion has consistently applied different rules to Africa." Vance's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it, his expression tightening at whatever instructions he'd received. "This conversation isn't over," he said curtly, turning to rejoin his team. "No," Traoré agreed quietly to his retreating back. "It's only the beginning." As the impromptu gathering continued, Adama found himself approached by representatives from multiple African nations, each pressing notes into his hands, requesting follow-up meetings. The young diplomat who had once dreamed of a prestigious position with an international organization now found himself at the center of what might become a continental realignment. Outside the conference building, crowds had begun to gather as news spread through social media. Ordinary citizens of various African nations, living in the host city, arrived with hastily made signs supporting Traoré's stand. "African solutions for African problems," read one. "Partnership, not patronage," declared another. Back inside, Traoré watched the scene unfolding beyond the windows, his expression thoughtful. "I made a promise," he said to Adama, "the day we took power, not for wealth or position, but to ensure that the next generation wouldn't face the same dependencies we inherited. Some would say today makes that promise harder to fulfill," Adama observed. "Perhaps," Traoré nodded. "Or perhaps it finally makes it possible." The afternoon wore on, the formal agenda of the conference abandoned as new connections formed across traditional boundaries. Representatives from countries heavily dependent on Western aid watched cautiously from the sidelines, their hesitation understandable yet tinged with unmistakable interest. Vance emerged from his huddle with a new determination, approaching the gathered African representatives with a revised message. "The United States remains committed to African development," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone reclaiming narrative control. "While we respect sovereign decisions, we must also ensure taxpayer resources advance shared objectives and values. We look forward to continued engagement with partners who share our vision for the region." The diplomatic language couldn't mask the implicit threat. Those who followed Burkina Faso's example would face similar consequences. Traoré listened without reaction, understanding the game too well to be provoked. When Vance finished, he simply nodded respectfully and turned back to his conversation with the Malian and Nigerian representatives. As evening approached, Adama found himself appointed to lead a hastily organized committee to develop a framework for regional cooperation, less dependent on Western approval. The quiet diplomat who had once carefully balanced between worlds now stood firmly on African soil, his American education serving African interests. "We'll need to move quickly," he told Traoré, as they prepared to depart. "They'll try to isolate us economically before any alternative structures can form. Then we'll move quickly." Traoré replied with the decisive clarity of a military man. "Contact our teams in Ouagadougou. The Chinese ambassador requested a meeting last week. Schedule it for tomorrow. The Turkish agricultural delegation should be prioritized, and reach out to our counterparts in the African Development Bank." As they walked toward the exit, they passed Vance's team, packing up their elaborate presentation materials, graphs and charts, showing prosperity that would now never materialize, at least not on American terms. Vance himself stood apart, speaking intensely into his phone. "No, sir, this wasn't foreseeable. He's not following the expected playbook. We may need to reconsider our approach to the entire region." Traoré paused briefly, catching Vance's eye. No words passed between them, but an understanding did. Power dynamics had shifted, permanently and profoundly. Outside, as sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, the crowd of supporters had grown. They parted respectfully as Traoré emerged, their spontaneous applause washing over him. A young woman pressed forward, offering him a small flag of Burkina Faso. "My father served in the military under Sankara," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He always told me that one day, someone would finish what Sankara started." Traoré accepted the flag, the weight of its symbolism far heavier than its physical presence. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who had renamed their country from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, land of incorruptible people, before his assassination remained the conscience of a nation. "We all serve the vision," Traoré told her simply. "No single person can complete it alone." As his security detail ushered him toward the waiting vehicle, Traoré caught a glimpse of Vance watching from the doorway, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, one man representing the fading certainties of an old order, the other embodying the unpredictable possibilities of a new one. At that moment, both understood a fundamental truth. The conversation hadn't ended. It had transformed. 6 months passed like water flowing over stone, gradually reshaping the landscape while revealing what had always been beneath the surface. The Ouagadougou International Conference Center, built with Chinese investment and Burkinabe labor, hosted the first Pan-African Resource Sovereignty Summit under a cloudless October sky. Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of the balcony, watching delegates arrive from across the continent. The journey since his confrontation with Vance had been neither easy nor straight, but the path had been their own. "The Malian delegation has arrived," Adama Ouedraogo announced, joining his president. No longer just a young diplomat, Adama now served as Minister of International Cooperation, his office tasked with navigating Burkina Faso's new multilateral approach to foreign partnerships. "And the mining representatives?" Traoré asked, his eyes following a convoy of vehicles flying South African flags. "Confirmed. South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, all sending their state mining companies. The new joint certification system will be operational by January." Traoré nodded, satisfaction briefly softening his usually composed features. The African Mineral Certification Framework represented months of difficult negotiations, creating a continental system to certify mineral exports without Western middlemen claiming their customary percentage. "The French newspaper is calling it resource nationalism," Adama added with a slight smile. "The Financial Times prefers market distortion." "And what does the Washington Post say?" Traoré asked, already knowing the answer. "That you're following the classic authoritarian playbook, with a full-page analysis by none other than JD Vance." Traoré's laugh was brief, but genuine. "At least he's still thinking about us." Below them, a demonstration of the new Burkinabe Civil Defense Force performed security protocols. The unit, trained jointly by Rwandan and Russian specialists, after American counter-terrorism support had been withdrawn, had successfully prevented 3 major attacks in the northern provinces. The rural electrification numbers came in, Adama said, consulting his tablet. 47% of villages now connected, up from 23% last year. The Turkish Burkinabe Solar Partnership is exceeding projections. Traoré absorbed this information with the same measured composure he brought to setbacks. After the confrontation with USAID, predicted economic punishment had indeed followed. Currency speculation had briefly destabilized the West African franc. Credit rating agencies had downgraded Burkina Faso's bonds. Western media had discovered a sudden interest in human rights conditions that had existed unremarked for decades. Yet, the expected collapse hadn't materialized. Instead, necessity had mothered innovation and cooperation. Dorda is waiting to brief you on the grain reserves, Adama reminded him gently. Traoré nodded, giving the gathering one last look before turning to follow Adama inside. The corridor leading to the conference chamber displayed a photo exhibition chronicling Burkina Faso's journey since independence. Thomas Sankara's portrait held the place of honor. The revolutionary leader, whose vision had been cut short by assassination, but whose spirit now found new expression. Beside it hung a new addition, a photograph of Traoré standing firm at the confrontation with Vance, captured by a journalist who had recognized the historical significance of that moment. In the main chamber, agricultural ministers from across the Sahel gathered around Daouda Ouedraogo, Burkina Faso's Minister of Agriculture and Adama's elder brother. Maps displayed the regional grain reserve system that now connected their countries, a simple idea implemented after decades of each nation managing food security in isolation. President Traoré, Daouda, acknowledged with a respectful nod as they approached. We've confirmed grain reserves, sufficient to weather 2 consecutive drought seasons. The surplus from Mali and Niger is being transported to the central facility now. The Nigerian representative added, our government has committed additional silos for the Eastern distribution hub. After the Western sanctions, we've all learned the importance of regional food security. Traoré surveyed the maps with careful attention, asking pointed questions about storage conditions and distribution logistics. Despite his military background, he had developed a farmer's understanding of agriculture's central role in true independence. A commotion at the entrance drew their attention as a late arrival caused heads to turn. JD Vance entered, no longer representing USAID but instead heading a private consulting firm, specializing in emerging market engagement. His Washington connections had cushioned his fall after the diplomatic embarrassment in Africa. Repackaging failure as specialized expertise. Traoré watched him navigate the room, noting how different he appeared in this context, no longer dictating terms, but seeking clients, his confidence replaced by careful deference as he approached an Angolan minister. Should I have security keep an eye on him? Adama asked quietly. No, Traoré replied. Let him see what he helped create. The day progressed through technical presentations and bilateral meetings, the substance of cooperation taking precedence over performative declarations. When Traoré finally took the podium to address the gathered representatives, the room fell into expectant silence. 6 months ago, he began without preamble. Many predicted that our insistence on genuine sovereignty would lead to isolation and failure. Some anticipated our return to the negotiating table, humbled and willing to accept any terms offered. Heads nodded around the chamber, the shared memory of Western predictions still fresh. Instead, we stand here having discovered something our nations have always possessed, but rarely exercised, the capacity to solve African problems through African cooperation. From his position near the back of the room, Vance watched with poorly concealed discomfort, shifting in his seat as the African leaders responded with murmurs of agreement. The grain reserves we've established mean no child in our region need starve while we wait for foreign aid shipments, The mineral certification system ensures our resources build our schools and hospitals rather than foreign bank accounts. The shared security protocol has reduced terrorist incidents by 60% across our borders. Traoré's voice remained measured, yet carried to every corner of the large chamber. Without technological amplification, the voice of a leader who knew his words would be remembered. These achievements are modest beginnings, not final victories. We face challenges that will require decades of determined effort to overcome, but we face them standing upright, not kneeling for approval. In the third row, the Chinese ambassador listened attentively, flanked by representatives from their infrastructure and mining corporations. Their expressions revealed nothing, but their presence spoke volumes. China had quickly adapted to the new landscape, offering revised terms more favorable to African interests once they recognized the shifting power dynamics. We welcome partnerships with any nation that respects our sovereignty, Traoré continued, acknowledging the global representatives with a measured nod. Trade that benefits both parties, investment that builds rather than extracts, security cooperation that protects our people rather than foreign interests. His gaze found Vance briefly before moving on. What we no longer accept is the fiction that our development must follow paths designed to maintain dependency rather than create self-sufficiency. As Traoré concluded his address, the gathered representatives rose in unified respect, not with the performative enthusiasm of political rallies, but with the solemn recognition that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between Africa and the world. The summit continued into the evening, with working groups forming around specific initiatives. Vance circulated at the margins, collecting business cards and making appointments, his role reduced from shaping policy to selling services. Later, as the formal proceedings gave way to a cultural celebration, Traoré found himself approached by an elderly diplomat from Senegal. "I was present when Sankara addressed the Organization of African Unity in 1987, the man said, his voice carrying the weight of decades, witnessing Africa's struggles. Months before his assassination, he told us that debt had become a tool of control, that aid had become the modern method of colonization. Traoré nodded, having studied those speeches carefully. Many applauded his words, the old diplomat continued, but few had the courage to implement them. They feared the consequences. Perhaps they were right to fear. He paid with his life. And we've all paid with decades of stagnation and dependency, Traoré replied quietly. The old man's eyes crinkled with a mixture of hope and caution. "I have seen many false dawns for Africa. Young man, what makes you believe this time is different?" Traoré considered the question seriously. "Because this time we're not seeking to win the game. We're wrenching its fundamental rules, not alone, but together." As the evening concluded, Traoré made his way through the crowd toward the exit, pausing briefly as he noticed Vance engaged in animated conversation with a Zambian official near the door. Their eyes met across the room, no longer adversaries in direct confrontation, but representatives of profoundly different visions for Africa's future. Vance nodded slightly, a gesture somewhere between diplomatic acknowledgement and reluctant respect. Traoré returned the nod before continuing on his way, neither triumphant nor conciliatory. The battle had never been personal. It was historical, systemic, generational. Outside, the lights of Ouagadougou spread before him, a city whose name meant where people receive honor and respect in the Mossi language. Children played soccer in the square despite the late hour, their energy undimmed by the day's heat. "Your convoy is ready, Mr. President," his security chief informed him. "Will you be returning to the palace?" Traoré shook his head. "Take me to Zaktouli village. I promise to visit their new solar island." As the vehicles prepared to depart, Traoré noticed a small group of university students watching him, their expressions a mixture of hope and wariness. The perpetual look of a generation that had seen too many promises broken to trust easily. He approached them, his security detail following at a respectful distance. "What are you studying?" he asked the young woman, who seemed to be their leader. "Agricultural engineering," she answered, straightening with pride. "My research focuses on drought-resistant millet varieties." Traoré nodded approvingly. The most revolutionary act is to produce our own food. The young woman's eyes widened slightly at hearing Sankara's words. That's why I chose this field, sir. But some say we're still too dependent on foreign technologies, foreign markets. For now, Traoré acknowledged. True independence comes in stages, built through daily choices and long-term vision. Another student spoke up, his voice carrying both respect and challenge. And if the Western nations increase pressure, if they try to isolate us completely, Traoré considered the young man thoughtfully, then we will adapt again. Our ancestors crossed the Sahara and navigated the Congo without foreign approval. We can build a nation on the same strength. As he returned to his waiting vehicle, Traoré's phone buzzed with a message from Adama. Chinese counterproposal received for the dam project. Much better terms than previous offer. He smiled slightly, tucking the phone away. The leverage of options, the simple power of being able to say no, was already reshaping relationships that had seemed immutable for generations. As the convoy pulled away from the conference center, they passed a billboard recently erected by the Ministry of Public Education. It displayed a simple quote from Thomas Sankara: "We must learn to live the African way. It's the only way to live in freedom and with dignity." Below these words, in smaller text, appeared a line that had become the unofficial motto of Traoré's government. True partnership begins with respect, and respect is never given freely. It must be claimed. Did this story touch your heart? Has something similar ever happened to you or someone you know? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If you enjoyed this journey of transformation and discovery, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that reveal the truth about human connection, dignity, and the unexpected moments that change lives forever. Every like, comment, and share helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments.